Well, as Mr. Hunter said, I am the Director of Curriculum Instruction. However, when we applied to be a RISE pilot, it was with the understanding that my role in the district would have to change somewhat as well. And so my focus last year was really to be the catalyst in each of the buildings, because I had to get the same message out to each of our staff, and so they could hear those guided instructions the same way every time. So what we started to do is walk them through each of the steps, and I know all of you have been to riseindiana.org, and they have all the documents, and they have step 1, step 2, step 3, they have PowerPoints, they have videos. It's a wonderful resource, but as you know, things can get lost in translation. And so you have to make sure that it's very consistent across the building and across all the schools in the district, and that was my role. So the way that worked was I would work with the building level principals to schedule staff meetings or go in during collaboration time and train the staff on the next step of RISE. So that's how we started last year. We started by using some of the videos of teachers and having the teachers use the rubric and decide how they would rate them. Would they be a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 4, and why? Some of the schools chose not to approach it that way, but we wanted to ease the teachers as, you could do this. You could be on the other side of that very easily, and you know what good teaching looks like. And it's very evident. And so just do what you always do and do it well, and we'll go through this together. So that was one of the first steps that we did, just so that they could get used to the principals coming into their classrooms. Because that's the first thing, we've got to get that process started. Once they were used to principals walking in or administrators walking in and doing observations, then we could really focus on their instruction and focus on their students and that next step of SLOs. So I had to work I work K-12. We only had the 3 buildings. We have 2,400 students, and so I went into every teacher at every level and made sure that they were comfortable. As you know, some teachers are accountable with growth model data because they have ISTEP and ECAs to be accountable for. There's a whole other population in the schools that are just equally as important that don't have that. And so I had to work with both ends of that. I made sure that our ECA and our ISTEP teachers were very comfortable, and they just knew that the accountability was there. It was already given to them and prescribed that those teachers aren't going to use ISTEP as their growth model. And then those that have growth model data, like our 4th and 5th grade teachers, they teach all subjects, and they knew that ISTEP was going to be their big crux of growth model. But then they were told, you have to write your student learning objective on, if you're 4th grade, on science, and if you're 5th grade, on social studies. And so that was, oh my gosh, now I'm accountable for the English language arts and the math, and now you're holding me accountable to the science with the student learning objective. And so we had to walk through that and help them understand that that was just the next most critical thing, because what the state guided us to do is pick the subject area that they had the most credibility in the assessment that was created. And so that's why it was decided that ECA and ISTEPs would be that most credible assessment. AP exams at the high school, if every student's required to take it in that class. So because science and math are reimbursed, we had every student take it, and they knew that that was one of the prerequisites signing up for those courses, because it's open enrollment. Students couldn't self-enroll into AP courses, but it's with the understanding that you will take the AP exam at the end, and it is expected that you'll get a 3, 4, or 5. And that was a huge change for our high school staff to have to adjust to that and make sure that the students knew up front that they were going to be expected to do that. So with that, those teachers are in place. We've helped them. We had to figure out, when writing those SLOs, and it says how many students, and bucketing their students, or levels of preparedness, the more professional way, but basically they're taking their students, they're looking at previous data and grouping their students. Before I go on though, I just kind of want to know, how many of you are elementary principals? How many of you are middle school or high school, secondary? How many of you are central office? And how many are classroom teachers? Okay. All right, so we do have a wide range, and so I'll try to talk to everybody. So if you have specific questions, feel free to ask, because I think that's the best way to answer those. So once the ISTEP teachers knew that their accountability was already decided for them, they then had to then go back and look at data on the students that they had enrolled, because it's one class period that you're writing that for. At the elementary school, of course, you have your class, it's decided for you. But with Sarah, I've got 7 classrooms of English language arts. Which one am I going to write that student learning objective for? And so then you look at the levels of preparedness for those students and which ones have the prerequisites to be successful and which ones do not. And what we had to decide as a grade level, as a staff, what are we going to use as previous data to determine that? And that's a whole conversation in itself. So we do star reading, it's just a screener, but it did give us an idea of reading levels for every student from grade 2 all the way up to grade 10. Those students take star reading 3 times a year, beginning, middle, and end of the year. And so we can track their reading levels. So that was one data point we had. Of course, we were all trained with triangulation of data and trying to find other pieces. In the primary grades, we were using in-class Dibbles TRC levels. At the middle grades at the elementary, we're using more of the AR type level of the star reading assessment. We also use Acuity in our district. If it's free and I can get it from the state, I will try. We will apply because we need that. So we use Acuity, and we've used it for different purposes. But that was another data point. And step. But of course, because we're a Title I school, we were sorting and ranking our students anyway. So we already knew those levels of preparedness pretty easy. It was the administrators that had access to that up until last year. We were the ones with all keeper of the knowledge, and we would give that information out, or we thought it was too confidential to have every teacher know the level of every student. Well, if those teachers have that accountability, they needed to have access to those scores just like an administrator did. So SDA 5-star is what we have. Again, it was something that came free. So we jumped on that. That's just your data warehouse. It was a place that all of our teachers have access to every student's scores now. So they could take ownership and they could find out what the levels of those students were for star reading, for I-STEP, their lost links, whatever testing, ECAs, plan, Ready Step, whatever we're given. We put all those scores up there so the teachers have access to those students. And then they can decide what they want as a department to make their levels of preparedness. So that's the first step, is making sure you have that structure in place at the district level, that teachers have access to it, so that then they can make their level of preparedness list. So out of 20 students, they know that they have 10 in the high group, 5 in the medium group, and 5 in their low group. And then they have to determine, what are we going to do? Well, the state gives you guidance, and they say in order to be highly effective, it has to be all your high, all your medium, and most of your low. Well, last year that was left at each administrator's discretion with the teacher, and then great conversation to determine that. Well, what we found is we needed as an administrative team to be a little more consistent with what does most mean. If you're talking about 10 students in your low bucket, what's most? Is that 7 or is that 8 or is that 6? And so that's where you need to be consistent as an administrative team before you go, because then that's what may pit one administrator against another. Well, the assistant principal said 6 or 7 was most, and now you're saying I have to be 7 or 8. So we want to make sure you're consistent. I know, and Dave can talk to you more about the middle school. They work very collaboratively to make sure that they both agree and that they both will sign off on the exact same thing. So that would be that. But what I did was I sat with each of those departments or grade levels. And if teachers, after sitting with the grade level, decided they still needed individual meetings or one-on-one, I went in during the prep time. They could call me on the phone and say, Tammy, this is what I'm thinking. These are my students. This is where they fall. What do you think about writing it this way? And so, like I said, we did 2-hour preps. We did floating subs. We did after-school collaboration meetings. And I just made myself available to go in and walk them through that process. Many of them do it during department meetings now, but last year when we were writing that SLO for the first time, I sat with every person, every department, and made sure I gave them guidance so that they knew what they were, they weren't out there alone. I just wanted them to feel supported more than anything. And then you got to the group that fall into that gray area where they don't have that built-in accountability of a test. And so we had to look at what other tests do we have out there. Do we have one that's provided by the state Do we have one, it may not be an ECA or ISTEP. Is there one still provided by the state that we're using that we could use as the end of course assessment? Or do we need to create them? And in many cases, we had to create them. I'll start at the elementary level. It's very interesting. Our special area teachers are, art, music, PE. They never gave grades. You have to understand we have one elementary school of 1,200 students. We have one PE teacher that sees K2, and we have one teacher that sees 3-5. And the students come in and they teach them. The teacher gets a prep time and they pick them up and then they go. There was no accountability. Now all of a sudden we're requiring them to be very accountable to those students and to determine what are your standards, what are you going to do as your assessment. And we had to go through that assessment approval process. So I had to walk them through that and teach the administrators, do you know what depths of knowledge are? And are you really going to hold them to some accountability pieces there? What will that look like for that teacher? The art teacher, how am I going to do that? It was more portfolio based. They're not going to give a written test to a second grader on a art project, but they can definitely do a portfolio where they would have those pieces and all their standards were covered, because when you have to go through the assessment approval, you have to make sure that that assessment covers every standard. There's questions that cover every standard, and you have to make sure that you reach the depths of knowledge or Bloom's taxonomy levels. And so teachers needed training on that, and so that was my role, would be then to go in and help teachers with that. I did that had to do that at the elementary in several areas, not so much at the junior high because they share so many teachers. So that same art teacher that got trained at the elementary school then went to the junior high and could do her classes that way there as well. When you go to the high school, there are several courses that fall under the gun of not having that. However, we have Project Lead the Way. Well, what better assessment than to use the Project Lead the Way as their assessment at the end of the course? We have the AP classes we had to talk about. The other thing that's real critical when you determine which class period, we had to talk about ones where they could collaborate with someone else. So for example, I had a teacher at the high school last year who taught one AP senior English, French, and a junior, or a senior, just a regular senior English that was not AP. And she wanted to write it on French. And I said, well, the problem is you're the only French teacher. So you don't have anybody to collaborate with, so you have no support. And I have nothing to compare it to because you're the only one. And so I said, however, you do teach a senior English course, and so does the person across the hall from you. So you say that I get to choose the class period and the class that I'm going to write my SLOs on, but you're telling me not really. And I said, that's correct, because I want you to pick the one that has someone to collaborate with. And that's a protection for you, and it's a protection for us as an administrative team. So they had to then agree on what they were going to use as the end of the course assessment for senior English. So we had to go through all the standards, and we had to write that together. And then once that was approved by the administrator, then they could set their SLO marks. What percentage, what mastery do you expect them to have? 80%, 85%? Of course, some of them wanted to say, well, this is a dual credit course, and we can go through Ivy Tech, and their mastery level is 70%, so we think ours should be 70% as well. And that was a whole conversation to have and say, you really think as long as they get 70% of the content that's mastery? But what great conversation starters to have with the administrator. And the administrators up to that point had not had the opportunity to have those rich conversations with the staff and where are we going to set the bar. So that's how our conversations changed last year as a result of writing the SLOs. So like I said, we get subs, we schedule these times to write assessments or to pull. The one that I like the best that I refer to as my health teachers, PE teachers, advanced PE. They're all varsity coaches in some regard. So we have football coaches, we have basketball coaches, and then we have a man that's taught for 30 years. And I walk in and I'm going to help them write an assessment. And I'm going to help them write their SLOs. And Mr. Hunter said, if you can work with them, you'll work with anybody. And I said, okay. So I go in, guns loaded, and they were the best group to work with because they're like, I said, bring what you already have. We're not going to throw the whole thing out and start over. I'm not requiring that. Let's look at what you're currently doing and build from there. So they say, okay. They bring in a 100 question test and a Scantron paper. And I said, okay, great. Here, did you look at the assessment provided, the things that they walk you through in riseindiana.org? The first one says the standards. Let's make sure all your standards are assessed. They're like, okay. So they've got a copy of their standards. They've got that little checklist that says question 1 aligns to this standard. Question 2 aligns to this standard. We're going through, well, these are pretty smart men because it didn't take them long to figure out, I don't need 100 questions to cover all the standards. So we got to about question 30 and they're like, hey Tammy, I think we've got all those standards covered. I said, okay, great. Perfect. Let's just skip the rest of the test. Well, it is a 90-minute class, so what are we going to do? I said, okay, fair enough. So let's go to this next process of writing an assessment. True story. Let's go to the next step. Well, the next step asks them to look at depths of knowledge. Well, we found out of those 30 questions, there were a lot of level 1 and level 2 questions. And you know that wheel that they provide you at the state? So we're looking at the different verbs that are used and asking them to explain. That wasn't on their test, or justify, that wasn't on their test, or create, that was on their test, and they're quickly seeing, Tammy, most of our questions are either true, false, or multiple choice. And I said, okay, fine, where does that fall into depth of knowledge? So they're going through and they're looking at those verbs, and they said, here's the problem, most of our test is really only level 1. There may be a couple level 2s, and I can explain why. And I said, okay, so then the question is, what are we going to do? How are we going to assess level 3 and level 4 depths of knowledge in health class? Or in the advanced PE course. I said, well, let's go back to that wheel of verbs and let's see what you're doing. I said, tell me what else you do in class. You surely don't just teach, you know, the chapter by chapter. Well, no, we do a nutrition unit, and we're doing a whole, you know, like we go and do a public service where we're talking about decision making and healthy choices. And I said, oh, okay. And you know, when they start explaining what the curriculum looks like in a semester-long course like that, they're doing some really great projects that really did require students to create and justify and compare. And I said, why can't we take that written assessment and take the results of those projects and combine that together to get all of your levels? And then you would have your true end-of-course assessment that would cover all the standards and all the depths of knowledge. Well, then I had some buy-in because I didn't ask them to start completely over. But we had to think differently about that. With those projects, I said, do those students know up front what's expected to get an A, B, C, or D on that project? What is the difference between an A or a B? And so they had to really do it. What they had to do was create a rubric for each of those. Once they had their project description, I said, explain it to them. They're explaining it to me. I said, where's the written form you give to the students? Well, we don't have it written out. I said, let's take time today to write it out. Let's write out that project description and what the goals are. Let's tell the students up front what standards you're covering by doing that project. And then let's create the rubric so they know exactly what's expected of them to get those levels of mastery that you want. That also then allowed the principal to be able to sign off on the projects and that assessment, that written assessment, to be a full approved assessment. And there's 3 people there, so it's district created, it was department created, it wasn't one teacher creating it by themselves. So that's the first step in the whole SLO process, is making sure you have an assessment in place that meets the rigor of it. Can I go back this year and make sure that we're really trying to embed some of the Indiana literacy standards for the technical areas and things? That absolutely. Can I make sure that some of the text that they're doing is at the rigor and levels of text complexity that they hope to get ready for PARC? Absolutely. But at that time, I needed to start somewhere. And that assessment I felt really proud of, because what they started with and what they ended with were night and day. They felt very comfortable with it. They would even say, hey, Tammy, come by and look at these projects. At the end, the principal, I just said, I want to see an example of a high, a medium, and a low, and what you would expect. They had the portfolios at the end, the projects at the end to justify that. So the assessment's now approved. That's what the principal had to take time to look at, though. And the teachers are getting it to you. As the principal, they're going to hand you, here's how I know this question answers this standard, and this is how it's the depths of knowledge. They turn that in before you sign off. Then we had to take the list of students. We had to show them how to get into SDA and how to access all those test scores. And then it's like, what do you do with those test scores? Well, many of my teachers, they just made a table. and they just started grouping those kids. Well, then they got colorful, and then they decided that they were going to color them high, medium, and low. So then we had the red, yellow, and green back to the stoplight, and they could, with a glance, they knew, okay, all the students in my classroom, these 20 students, this is how many have, would fall in each of those. Now you know exactly how many students in each of those groups. That conversation never would have occurred before. They would have went in, they would have taught whoever shows up. I mean, that's what a good teacher does. I don't want to know information about them. I don't want to make that, predetermined decision about that student. I just want to teach and give them a fresh start. Well, that's great, but then that health teacher said to me, now I understand why they're not turning in all the questions at the end of every chapter or subunit. And I said, why? He said, hey, he's in a 3.0 reading level, and that textbook's, a sophomore health textbook. I said, okay. I said, so what are you going to do now? Now that you know that, what are you going to do? Well, I can pair him up with somebody, or I guess maybe I could read it to him, or I could tape it, or, I said, exactly, or why don't you have one of those students that gets it, tape it for you, and then they can listen to it, or make a podcast, and they can listen to it that way. However you want, let's make that accessible to all those students at their level so you can gauge what they know and not how well they read in your class. So we had to have some ways to make some interventions and some modifications for that content that they never would have tried to do before. And that's, and that's our coaches, They say, oh, are they really teaching? Oh yeah, they are. They just have just as much buy-in to that process as that teacher that's held accountable with that AP exam or that ECA. So we went through that. We had to make the bucket list, or the levels of preparedness list for each of those teachers, and then they had to actually go about writing the SLOs. And that's where we get the most phone calls from every district that I've talked to, and every time I present, we spend the most time talking about actually just writing the SLOs and setting the percentages for highly effective and effective and improvement necessary. And then the targeted with, did they meet it, did they exceed it, where did they fall? So we had to have that conversation. And I think that's once I give them the skeleton, that's where I get to step back and take a back seat, and the principal gets to have that conversation with the teacher, because the principal knows the students in that building a lot better than I do, and they can understand, out of those 10 kids in that low bucket or in that low level, if I say most and I'm justifying mine at 8 and the person across the hall is justifying theirs at 6, is there a reason behind that? Well, behind closed doors, that administrator and that teacher, or in their PLC, if they can have that discussion together, what more powerful conversation, because it's focused on student learning. Every conversation is truly about not how well I taught it and how did I do on the rubric, but it's on that second domain on instruction. How do those students learn, and what proof do I have that they actually are getting it, or that I had to go back and reteach it? So the SLOs, although there's so much pressure on, what I have to say is there's an example, thanks Dave, of how they actually took the information from Star Reading and from previous year's ISTEP, and then they were able to group their students. So that's just, it's simple. I know it seems complex, but it's really simple. It becomes very evident on how you group those students. It's such a small percentage of their overall effectiveness rubric. I have many Group 1 teachers and many Group 3 teachers. I don't think I have any that really fall into that Group 2, and so it's very few. What we also had to do and change the mind culture in our district is the special ed teachers that push in and co-teach. We had to assign them, and with STN and with the CC report and the CE reports and all the different state reports, we can now assign that one student to 4 different teachers if necessary. Because I've got a Title I teacher that's working with them in language arts, but I have a special ed teacher that's working with them in math because they have math IEP goals, and then I have the classroom teacher. So that one student may have 3 teachers accountable for their success. And so you can go in and actually do that. And so that was the wonderful thing, because true collaboration really comes into play when they're all accountable for those students. And although we spend so much time on those SLOs, when you look, it's such a small percentage for those Group 1 teachers, 10%, 5% for the class goal and 5% for the targeted. For the Group 3 teacher, we're 75%, that's where most of my high school teachers fell, 75% of theirs, well actually all of them, are the teacher effectiveness rubric of what the principal observes. And our principals observe 5 times a year each teacher. So they, I said 75% of What's important is what they're seeing every day in your classroom. That's what you need to focus on. The 20% are those SLOs that we've just written and spent a whole day writing the assessment and getting those goals written. But it's 10% for that class goal and 10% for the targeted goal in that small group and what you make specific for their goal. I had a teacher yesterday, and I had a person who I was talking to at break, and they said, well, you know, the beautiful thing about that for this high school and that 8th grade social studies teachers, they wrote the assessment. They know exactly what's on the test. They can teach to it. They can do, right, that's true, but you would be surprised, and you will be surprised at the end of the year, how many teachers, even knowing that they created that rubric and they created that assessment and got it approved, the students still may or may not meet that mark. I had a teacher I worked with yesterday in the facts department. She said, I was deemed an effective teacher, but I still didn't have all my students meet that to make me effective with my SLO. I said, really? Talk to me about that. She said, well, I had one student that had really had a life event that, you know, I had to work for them, and 80% mastery was our goal, and at the end I was just trying to get 60% mastery for that student because they weren't coming to school. That, you know, and think like, okay, you know what? You know exactly why that one student, you didn't abandon that one and just focus on the others, because that's what counted towards your percentages. And if it's only 5% or 10% of your overall effectiveness, it's a small portion, but what it does is it makes you very, very accountable for the students in your classroom. And if they're doing it for one class period, you don't even have to require that they do it for all the other class periods, because that's what our high school principal wanted to do. He said, well, we've mastered this one class period, one class, focusing on those 25 students. Now are we going to 2 classes next year, or are we going to go to all of them, or do they have to write SLOs for every class and group their students for every class? And I said, no. No, the state required one. We're not, and we were a pilot, and now we're going to do it for real next year, right? And so we're going to stick with the one. Many of our teachers, after finding the value of doing that, did it on their own for those other classes anyway, because now they know all that information about that one class, and they're seeing results with that class that they may or may not be seeing with another class. So now it's piqued their interest, so now they want to go grab that data about the other classes so that they can equally compare and know what they're doing. So it's really changed the culture of the school corporation, and it's changed the way teachers think about those class periods, and not just kids coming in, I'm going to teach it, and they're going to walk out, and I don't want to have that information to predetermine my opinion about them at the beginning. Wow, that's really information that I need to have. You know, they want it, and if they're locked out of SDA, I had a couple teachers that were locked out of SDA at the beginning of the year for some reason. He said, I can't get in, what's wrong, you know, before they didn't even know it was there. So that's how it's really changed the district, but again, there are specific issues for every one of those little teachers that don't fall into the nice box. I had a music teacher, very, very bright, leadership, went through leadership, you know, licensed principal, and he's our music teacher, and he said, I want some guidance. Is the state going to give us guidance? Where are we with this? And we kept asking the TNTP, said, well, you know, I think we've got some samples from Rhode Island, let me get back to you. Never got back to him. So when all the SLOs were due, I said, you are the only person that is not truly sent. Are you trying to buck the system? What's the problem? You know, just give it to me. And he's like, I was still waiting on guidance from the state. They said they were going to provide it. And I said, well, you saw that didn't happen, so let's just go. He has the most amazing rubric and the most amazing projects, and the way he values his students and how he's doing short cycle assessments with them, that he just wanted to make sure what he had set out to do, what he was already doing, really mirrored what the state wanted. And at the end, they weren't able to provide that guidance. And so I know in our training, we got very frustrated when they'd say, well, that's a local decision. That's a local decision. And I kept thinking, just if you know what the answer is, just give it to us so we can move on. We don't have time for this. Let's not make it a secret. At the end of the year, we were really grateful that some of those things were a local decision, because who knows the students in your community better than your staff and your administrators. So for that, we were really grateful that some of those are local decisions. And when we went back and had conversations with the state, we didn't have one thing that they said, that was a local decision and you made the wrong choice. There was one thing they wanted. They wanted our high school to give, to write SLOs in September for end of the course assessments. I said, you know, that's just not going to work for us. And they're like, oh yeah, it is. Just get them in by October. And I said, yeah, that's great. Here's the problem. Even in our small community, we have a lot of students change classes at semester. Well, Tammy, it's a year-long course. They're still going to be teaching. I said, but you told them one class period. If they pick 6th period, and those kids are now not in 6th period, Those same students are, yes, in the same course, but now they're in first period or fourth period. They changed the levels of preparedness in that class. He goes, I don't think that's going to happen. I said, okay, I'm going to show you data. So we'll write them in October and November. We'll get them approved. And then in January, I'm going to give those teachers an option to go back and update, because now we know that they've got a whole new slew of students. Well, when we went to the state and said, here's the evidence, 70% of our school at the high school who had written their SLOs in October then had to rewrite it in January, because the students sitting in their class second semester changed that much. So now you see the guidance in RISE 2.0. They now have the option. If you're going to be a semester course, we recommend you write your SLOs for second semester. So they really did take the feedback that the RISE pilot districts provided and made some adjustments to what they thought were going to be out there. That's not the only way, but that was one of the suggestions. Last year we didn't have media specialists or Title I teachers write SLOs because they didn't have that one class. Counselors, we didn't have write SLOs. We didn't have them go through that process of a rubric necessarily, the same RISE rubric. Well, we had to beef that up, because now with the requirement with the state, what are you providing for every certified staff member? So we used the school librarian rubric. However, the state, from Robin and Avon, I think she's the president of their Libraries Association, said it's not required, the rubric can stand alone. And we said, no, you know what? Our librarians feel they are just as valuable as every classroom teacher, and I believe they are too, and in order to do that, they also have to write SLOs. They have to be just equally as accountable as a classroom teacher. So our librarians are writing SLOs. Dave can talk to you about that, because I know he's already been submitted to him. Our counselors, we have an elementary counselor that we know her job looks completely different than the high school counselor, who provides more guidance and college preparedness and things than this one who's dealing with a child who may have, gone through divorce or life, traumatic. But they get to write SLOs that are appropriate for their role. So we made sure that we're using, and we are using the state's counselor rubric as well. One of our counselors happened to be on the creation of that, and so we were rolling with that as well. So we know that we have a rubric in place for every certified employee, and they are all writing SLOs. So I can answer any specific questions you have about SLOs, but that's kind of the process that I had to go through as far as central office helping get those in place.
So your reference just now for your librarians writing SLOs, can you give an example of what that might look like?
Well, and that's what I said, Tom, I said we need to provide some guidance for all these non-traditional teachers. And so Tom and I sat down and we wrote out what a possible SLO would look like for a Title I teacher, a counselor, for the librarians. The one that I said is, I got my library media license as well, and I do see the value in them, and I know that I've always went back and told the principal it's just as important. We have just as much impact on the literacy scores of a building as the classroom teacher teaches reading, because we can help them find that just right book, and we can make sure that they're getting that exposure to literacy that they may not. We can teach them about primary sources. So what I said is, for the class goal, you have 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade I-STEP scores in that building. Why not look at the level that we have total passing? What have we been in the past? Where are we setting our goal for the building? So that could be the class goal. And then the targeted goal, I said, what is a reflection? What are you passionate about that you spend the majority of your day or your year doing? Is it the number of collaborations that you do with teachers in projects? Do you have rubrics for those? How do you set those out? Pick one of those if you'd like, and really focus on that class and what their content knowledge is. What I found from my media specialist at the high school, or at the elementary school with 4th and 5th grade, she already did a pre-test of what they knew about encyclopedias, what they knew about reference materials, and what they knew about finding things on the web. And so she kind of gives them a pre-test and a post-test to see where they are at the end of their understanding with that. After talking to her, I know that they had a PLC with the media specialist yesterday, and so I'll be interested to see what she turns out. But those were the ones that I originally put out as a sample. Let's look at the I-STEP scores, because that's very, very data-driven, and it's, you do see every class every week. So You should have some accountability to that. But then the targeted one, I wanted them to have some ownership on that, and the fact that maybe the number of collaborations. I didn't want it to be the number of books in and out of the library, because I think media specialists play a much more vital role than just getting those books in and out. So that was what I recommended for them. Title I, they have specific students that in ours were targeted, Title I, and so we have specific students that they may see 60 students in the course of a school year, some for 6 weeks, some for a semester, some for year long, but they have beginning of the year data and end of the year data on those students. And it may not be achievement, but it could be growth that we measure them on. And then you may have a specific, we have level of literacy intervention with Fountas and Pinnell. You may have a specific group of students that you work with, those LLI groups. And where were they at the beginning with their TRC levels, and where are they at the end of those TRC levels? Now, I know that some trainers and some of the ed service centers have gone out and said that they don't think it's a good idea to use MCLAS, DIBELS, TRC, because they heard that the state may be taking that away. I contacted the state, that's not in their plan, and that is the most consistent that we have. So they are continuing to use MCLAS, DIBELS, TRC levels. What we found at our elementary school is that our levels, we set the bar higher than what the state guidance is on the Rise Indiana website. So we continue to keep our bar where we wanted it. So we're a little bit higher than what the state provided as guidance, but nobody's going to get you for raising the bar a little bit. So that's how we did it with our Title I teachers as well. Yeah.
When you started, there were no course line assessments. This is a high school question. They were not available. Now they are. What is your plan with that, and what would you recommend to schools who are starting this year?
We are using the state's ECA because...
Well, not DCA.
Well, no, but their end-of-course assessments provided for all Core 40 courses. Right. And so we're going to use those. Even though many of our teachers like these, even the English 12 teacher who wrote her own assessment last year, if the state's providing one, because we were assured that the state went back and took those off and re-looked at them and made sure that depths of knowledge and some of the literacy standards were embedded. I had to call the state and say, now, will those be all online, or are those going to be paper pencil? Because we're looking at the number of, computer labs that we have, and we have some students that may have 6 of those courses, and we've tried to get those scheduled into our computer labs would be a nightmare. They're all paper pencil. And they will provide scoring guidance, but it will be up to the school to score their own. So we can still do it in the same fashion that we would a final exam, in the same timeline. So we are going with those at our district. That was our choice. Again, local decision, and that's just what worked for us. Because I'm hoping that the state's test took more than one person, 1 or 2 people to create it, and I bet their test writing experiences were a little bit more than ours. That's what we chose.
What does SLO look like for essential skills?
Essential
Moderate
skills.
and severe population.
Well, luckily, Connie Hempstead, our special ed director, who also did all the evaluations and observations for our SPED department, was on that committee that went up and talked to them, and they get to write 2 targeted goals. So I was able to talk with one of those teachers actually this week, and she said, Tammy, our administrator wants us, when we write the targeted goal, to make sure that we have everybody accountable. So she was writing, 6 of these kids have a common skill of communicating with, they're using Kuno tablets, and where they are right now and how often they're using it versus, but the other 4 kids, they're not using it, that's not their goal. So I said, what are you making for a separate goal for them? And so she went to look at, some real specific goals of, potty, restroom break type things, and how are they, in that level. Real specific to their needs. That's why they have an IEP, and that can't trump that. You've got to take that into account. So it's where are they, and what's going to show, the worth, and what does that teacher spend the most time on? So.
What are you using for your SLPs?
Speech is a whole different ballgame. Let's just know that, to be quite honest, we've had quite a turnover in our speech pathologists this year, all of them. So we just tried to... Yeah, that's true. That's true. So I'll probably call now.
One of the things with ours, we have 2 speech pathologists that we've had for 20 plus years. Both of them quit or retired like the week before school started.
2 days. The Friday before.
So I now have 4 part-time, non-teaching speech pathologists. So they don't have a teaching license. They are speech pathologists that I had to go out and contract with. So it's a completely, it's a different picture this year. So it's another one of those things where I said, you can't do everything in one year. So, you know, let's don't focus on that. Let's get the kids the speech that they need. We'll have the whole summer now to go out and try to recruit a couple of speech pathologists that have a teaching license, and then we can concentrate on that next year. It's not a very good answer, but I think it's true.
But Elkhart, sounds like Elkhart has a rubric they're using for speech. You contact them? They love the networking.
Can you talk to us about when you were working with your staff and developing their class of SLOs and determining those, you know, you looked at how effective, and so forth, and then it talked about what percentage of those students you had to get mastery in order to fall into those categories. How did you guide them in determining and still build consistency across the corporation?
Well, luckily, the state gives you guidance on those documents at the bottom, and we really refer to those. Now, that was one where I know I sat next to Dave, and we were just frustrated that they wouldn't, you know, give us something besides most and many and all those things. Well, you know, it comes down to it, though, that if you know those students in that level of preparedness, and you want to be able to have that credibility. Now, it's important that Dave and Deb at the junior high, that he's not signing off on 80% or higher, and she allowed it to be 70% or higher, or, you know, 90% versus 80%. That makes a big difference. So it's important that as the district, you say, what do you consider most? Tom and I had an hour-long conversation about this week, and debating that, because you do want to provide some consistency and guidance, and that's where it is truly a local decision. But I would encourage you to meet with the administrative staff as a whole and just say, hey, we all need to be on the same page and come up with some definitions. 80% really is our crux. We really would like 90%, and that everybody's goal. So we wouldn't accept anything less than 80% of the low, because the definition says all high, all medium, and most of low. Well, if it's 10 kids and I want 80%, it better be 8 out of those 10 to be highly effective.
80 for highly, and what did you use for effective?
70.
70. And then
If you had to have it, and it's not defined that clean cut, I would like to tell you that it is, but it really comes down to specifics, and Dave can sit and give you a very specific example of looking at a group of students and why the teacher can justify that. But if I had to give guidance, and if I had to give a general statement, that would be it. Yes?
Jumping ahead a few months then, so you collected you chose this group, you collected your data. How, just the logistics of how you got the folks over the summer or whatever to?
Nope. You know, the logistics of actually getting them signed off on was huge in itself.
Yeah.
Because then I sat with the, luckily, Mr. Hunter gave me the opportunity to have an office at the high school last year. So I moved into the high school last year in October, and I didn't come back to the central office until February, because I sat with every teacher and we wrote those together, and then I sat with the principal and I helped him sign off on everyone. And if he wasn't comfortable signing off, helped him give guidance to those teachers so that they could raise their own expectations and encourage them up. So that took a long time. He would just say, I reviewed it, I'm ready to meet with you, come in during your prep. And so his secretary did a wonderful job of helping him with the checklist. We kept track of everybody that had turned them in, and then we kept track of when he had sent an email telling him that he was ready to review them with him, and then we checked off when they'd come in and they'd actually signed off. So it was every staff member with turn in, ready, and actual sign off. And then, as far as now, we're going back, we're just now doing step 5 now with our teachers. Because of, you know, we left, they did final exams, and I said to them, be ready to provide evidence for those percentages that you have. We didn't know we were doing step 5 necessarily until the end. We knew we would have to review them, but we didn't know there was going to be a clean-cut paper for them to do the reflection portion. That came out this summer, July 2012. So we're excited that it's out there on Rise Indiana, but that's what we were able to give teachers. That says step 5 and it's reflection piece, and it gave them a chance to really go in and reevaluate where they fell and tell us if they thought they were highly effective, and look at if there were reasons why, they could explain that. And so now Dave's meeting with every teacher or getting those things turned in, and he can talk more about how he's scheduling that in his building.
But that's based on last year.
It's based on last year's end of the course, yeah, and as you know, I mean, ISTEP came out in the summer. We still don't have individual growth model data, and we don't have school-wide letter grades. So, you know, that final is just not final yet. What they were able to say at the end of the year, based on the rubric, this is where you fall. Everything else will be dependent on, we won't do a summative until all those other scores come out.
Be very upfront with your staff. And maybe it's a little bit more solid now than what it was for us, but we were very upfront with them that things are going to change as the year went along. We found out more about RISE, like monthly. We find a new thing that we should have been doing or could have been doing that we honestly didn't know anything about. So it is kind of fluid and telling, you know, nothing is set in stone. And I think that really goes back to what the RISE people with TNTP kept telling us, that local decision, because there'll be some changes over the course of your year working with this. When you say that's true?
Yeah, they do some wonderful, they put some wonderful guidance out. They do a really poor job of promoting those things that are available. You don't know they're out there. We had, you know, Tom had given out the principals evaluation to the principals at the end of the school year, so they knew what to expect. And last year, I mean, and so they knew what was expected. And then I stumbled upon, Tom, did you see the new principals evaluation with SLOs? So then we had to have another meeting. I mean, the principals were like, oh, SLOs now for principals, and 50% of that's based on school-wide letter grade and SLOs. Wonderful. Had no idea that those were out there. You know, so you just have to check riseindiana.org, because that's where you're going to find the newest things. The SAMs and PAMs, you know, that's really, those links on there are critical. Read them with a fine-tooth comb. You know, there was one in the middle of August that said that you had to turn in, you had to submit your evaluation tools to the state, and they were going to upload those for you. Well, Tom said, yeah, I've already done that. I'm in compliance. You know, he shows me the green dots on there. I said, okay. So we went to a meeting last week, and somebody was talking about that again, and I said, Mr. Hunter, I don't think you would have signed off without us working on that together. It's about a 5-page document. He's like, where is it? I said, just humor me. Let's go back. We're going to go, I think it was sometime in August. Luckily, he keeps every superintendent's mailing. We went back, and sure enough, August 17th, August 27th, there was one that said, here's the link. You need to do this. And so just this week, we are finishing that process where you say, we couldn't just say we're a RISE 2.0 pilot and we're going with that and that's what we're going to use. We had to say on this page, this is the question where you know, kind of didn't know it was out there. That's another example of how the state has wonderful guidance that really caused us to have the opportunity to know exactly what's in that rubric, but didn't really do that. So that would be my recommendation, is check Learning Connection often and RISE often. Any other SLO specific questions? Yeah.
When you worked with, for instance, at the elementary, like with the grade 3 teachers, did they all come to a common SLO?
Well, we went with ISTEP, English Language Arts, because they don't have growth model, but we knew that literacy is our district's focus. It has been for 3 years and it will continue, and so we knew that the literacy needed to be our focus as the class goal. And then as far as their percentages, it would be varying on theirs. Their class goal was completely different based on that student's needs. I mean, that class group of needs.
But you never went below 80%.
What's that?
You never went below 80% to be effective.
Well, no, and we also look at, our elementary school already had scores that were well above 80, and so we wouldn't allow that anyway. So we had to go on historical data, and that was it. Like I had, I'll be honest, my biology CA teachers at the high school thought it would be rigorous enough for them to say that 50% of their students passing the ACA would make them highly effective. And I said, really, 50%? They said, well, historical data shows that, you know, we've never been above such and such. And I was like, okay. And, you know, that's a poor example. I think it was 75%. And I was just like, no. And he said, well, we've never been above 60%. So 75% is quite a rigorous goal. And again, that's where the building level principal gets to have that conversation with the teacher and agree on something and sign off. And then it's up to the superintendent to make sure the principals are not allowing anything that isn't rigorous enough. So,
Do you have literacy coordinators?
We have two, we have one literacy coach at the high school, or at the junior high, and one at the elementary.
So, do they take a class when they do their SLO and then a Title I group?
Well, he can tell you what the junior high did. Again, it's overall literacy.
Right.
Because they wouldn't be there if they weren't focusing on literacy. And we have 3, 4, 5 I-STEP scores, and we have 6, 7, 8 I-STEP scores. So their class, their whole class is the whole population literacy scores. And then they're targeted, they can focus on a specific class that they want to work on, or specific identified students in the low preparedness, because they're paid out to Title I funds. So let's have them focus on that low bucket of Title I students.
So they don't look at a whole grade level, like our literacy coordinators are primary, intermediate.
Okay.
So
So your class, just thinking out loud with you, K2, do you use DIBELS in class? Do you have that data? Do you use
NWEA.
NWEA? So you've got those scores right there, so they could actually look at the growth, how much growth did those students make across primary and across secondary. That could be a large group. And then they could focus on specific needs of whoever they target. If it could be a fluency or a comprehension or a writing. I mean, it could be very specific target. Okay. Any other questions on SLOs for me? Okay.